对议题敬请关注。
大家好，欢迎来到我们的华尔街争议节目。今天我们要探讨的是一个科技与医学交叉领域的热点话题：脑机接口技术如何让脑出血码农重返工作岗位。中国的数理创新集团在这个领域取得了突破性的成果，其自主研发的人工智能多模态脑机接口平台已经在临床上取得了显著效果，不仅帮助了脑卒中、脑创伤等病患恢复健康，还在自闭症、抑郁症等精神疾病的治疗方面展开了探索。这项技术的应用不仅让一位38岁的脑出血患者在42次训练后重返工作岗位，也为其他类似病例提供了希望。数理创新的创始人王威分享了他在创业过程中面对的种种挑战和成就感，并强调了国家支持对这一领域发展的重要性。数理创新不仅在国内领先，还在国际上占有一席之地。他们的目标是让脑机接口治疗下沉到社区，使更多患者能在基层医疗机构获得持续治疗。请大家继续收看详细内容，了解更多关于这项科技如何改变人们生活的故事。2016年，王威从任职多年的西门子医疗离职，决定在脑机接口这一前沿领域开启自己的创业之路。他创建了数理创新集团，致力于将脑科学与神经工程相结合，实现人体全生命周期的健康管理。澎湃新闻的报道揭示了数理创新在非侵入式脑机接口技术上的突破，尤其是在治疗肢体运动障碍方面的成就。数理创新自主研发的人工智能多模态脑机接口平台已经成功应用于临床治疗，主要针对脑卒中、脑创伤和脑肿瘤等疾病。迄今为止，已有超过1000例患者受益于这项技术，疗效显著。王威的团队不仅在成人患者中有所突破，还在神经发育障碍如儿童多动症、自闭症以及精神疾病如抑郁症的治疗方面持续探索。在数理创新的众多成功案例中，有一个特别令人感动的故事。去年5月，一位38岁的码农突发脑出血入院，出血量高达40毫升，导致言语不清、右侧偏瘫和理解力下降。几乎所有的医生都认为他的康复希望渺茫，家人也陷入绝望。然而，数理创新的脑机接口技术为他带来了希望。这位患者从6月开始接受治疗，通过佩戴脑电帽，系统能够读取他的运动意识，并将这些信号传输给外接的外骨骼设备，从而带动肢体运动。经过42次训练，他的肢体逐渐恢复运动，语言障碍也得到了显著改善。最终，他不仅恢复了正常生活，还重返了工作岗位。类似的病案还有很多，尤其是在老年中风患者中。许多患者在中风后6至8个月内没有好转迹象，但通过脑机接口治疗，他们重新获得了基本的生活能力。王威表示，看到病人从入院时的绝望状态到康复后的幸福生活，是这份工作最美好的部分，远胜过创业过程中的所有困难。除了脑卒中等疾病的治疗，数理创新也在努力将脑机接口技术应用于自闭症、多动症等儿童疾病的治疗。王威透露，他们已与复旦大学附属儿科医院建立合作，计划在年底推出针对自闭症的第1代诊断性产品。他相信，脑机接口技术不仅能帮助这些孩子进行交流，还能通过多模态数字疗法和范式训练稳定他们的情绪。持续探索精神疾病治疗。在精神疾病领域，数理创新也在探索如何利用脑机接口技术治疗抑郁症和焦虑症等。王威认为，这些技术能够为精神疾病患者提供新的治疗途径，帮助他们更好地管理情绪，重拾生活的信心。回忆起创业初期的艰难，王威感慨良多。那时，市场对脑机接口的认知度和接受度都非常低。融资时，投资方往往对这个新兴领域持怀疑态度。进入临床阶段后，他和团队需要不断与医生沟通，寻求合作机会。然而，随着一个个病例的成功，越来越多的医院开始接受这项技术，产品落地的可能性也不断增加。王威形容这一过程为临床教育和科学探索。幸运的是，国家在近年来加大了对新技术的支持力度，政策和基金的帮助使他们的探索更加顺利。 现如今，数理创新已经成为国际上最早将神经可塑性原理产品化的企业之一，产品成熟度在国际上领先。从早年被怀疑到如今的成功，王威的经历可谓是厚积薄发。在大学3年级进入实验室时，他就开始研究脑科学和脑机接口技术。英国留学期间，他继续在这一领域深耕。那时，医学、理学、工程学、材料学和人工智能的发展都限制了神经可塑产品化的可能性。但王威始终坚信这一领域的潜力，并不断思考如何将其变成现实。如今，数理创新的产品已经经过多次迭代，变得越来越成熟。市场不再需要从头解释脑机接口的概念，主动找上门的客户也越来越多。数理创新在上海长海医院以及全国多家医院都建立了脑机接口诊疗中心。王威的愿望是将脑机接口治疗进一步下沉，从3甲医院走向社区，让更多患者在社区内接受持续治疗。这样的尝试已经在北京、上海等多个地区开始试点。然而，这也带来了新的挑战，如何帮助社区建立团队和搭建使用场景，将成为另一个需要攻克的难题。王威相信，随着技术的不断进步和政策的支持，脑机接口技术将在更多领域发挥重要作用。他表示，数理创新将继续致力于技术研发和临床应用，力争为更多患者带来希望和改变。对于王威和他的团队来说，每一次成功案例都是对他们努力的最好回报，也是推动他们不断前行的动力。从西门子医疗的职场精英到数理创新的创业先锋，王威的故事不仅是一个科技创新的传奇，更是一个关于希望、坚持和无限可能的动人篇章。在脑机接口技术的加持下，无数患者将迎来重生的希望，重新拥抱生活的美好。在现代医学技术如火如荼发展的今日，我们或许依旧觉得科幻电影中的场景遥不可及。直到遇见这样一顶神奇的帽子，故事从一位叫小杰的软件工程师开始。他的人生曾被突如其来的脑出血彻底颠覆，38岁正值壮年的他成了半身不遂的人。多家权威医院的判定都如一把锋利的剑，刺痛了小杰和他的家人，康复的希望微乎其微。然而，去年6月，小杰在数理创新公司的新型治疗下，佩戴了一顶造型奇异的帽子，外加一双酷似钢铁侠装备的机械手套。奇迹渐渐发生，他的脑电波通过帽子的捕捉和传导，意念操控机械手套完成了各种动作。在这奇妙的过程中，小杰的大脑中枢神经系统逐步修复，最后他不仅能抬手拿筷子，甚至还能重新敲击键盘，回到工作岗位。你能想象吗？我仿佛在电影中重生般的重新站了起来。小杰感慨道。这听起来或许像是天方夜谭，但在脑机接口技术的介入治疗下，越来越多的不可能正变成可能。这一切的背后都要追溯到一位70后生物医学工程博士王威的努力。2016年，王威在上海创办数理创新公司，专注于脑机接口技术的研发与应用。他带领团队自主研发了人工智能多模态脑机接口平台，致力于改善中枢神经损伤或疾病引起的肢体运动障碍、意识与认知障碍等问题。自技术落地以来，数理创新已经为1000多位瘫痪病人带去了康复的希望。走进数理创新公司的展示厅，你会被一顶黑色网状、布满红色电极的帽子所吸引。这是脑机接口技术的重要利器，能够精准读取脑电信号，并转化为可量化的测试指标。通过人工智能分析，电脑屏幕上会显示出各种精神状态的指标。要知道，这项技术并非新鲜事物，早在50年前便有美国学者提出脑机接口的概念。然而，直到最近10多年，随着生物医学、通信与人工智能技术的迅猛发展，脑机接口技术才真正实现了跨越式的进步。王威的求学之路也充满了工程大片的味道。他本科就读于天津大学生物医学工程专业，师从中国脑机接口终身成就奖获得者王明石教授，随后赴英国深造，专攻脑机接口技术研究。尽管在20多年前，这一领域的探索受到软件、算法、人工智能和材料学等技术制约，但如今时机成熟，王威精准把握住了产业化加速的发展机遇，辞职创业，全力推动脑机接口技术的临床应用。 目前，数理创新团队的研发成果在国内外屡获认可，其中非侵入式脑机接口技术尤为引人注目。这项技术通过脑电信号直接控制外部设备，如机械臂等，不需要依赖脑的正常输出通路，解决了传统方法难以克服的瓶颈。在临床实验中，戴上脑电帽和机械手套的瘫痪患者，只需用大脑想象抓握的动作，机械手套便会实时响应，帮助完成肢体动作。这一过程不仅是简单的替代，更是让患者的大脑重新建立起代偿神经通路，促进运动功能的恢复。王威透露，3年来，数理创新已完成了1000多名病患的临床实验，成功率接近100%。每个疗程为18次训练，每次仅20分钟，效果显著。无论是软件工程师小杰，还是因脑出血导致言语不清、肢体失控的65岁王婆婆，经过治疗后都有了显著的改善。一些瘫痪6个月以上的患者，甚至已经能够自主行走、自己吃饭穿衣。正是这些具体而生动的案例，让王威和团队倍感成就与价值。尽管创业之路充满挑战，王威依旧信心满满。他希望脑机接口技术能服务更广泛的人群，让更多病患从中受益。如今，数理创新设备和治疗方案已在全国多家3甲医院和大型医疗机构落地，但王威的目标并不仅此。他希望能推动这项技术下沉到社区卫生服务中心等基层医疗机构，方便更多病人，特别是居家疗养的脑卒中患者接受治疗。此外，数理创新也在探索脑机接口技术在自闭症、多动症等儿童神经发育障碍方面的应用，比如为自闭症儿童创造虚拟场景，通过脑电信号与外界互动，帮助他们稳定情绪和提升交流能力。未来，公司还计划研发针对抑郁症、焦虑症等心理问题的产品，希望这项技术能为更多需要的人带去希望。王威的故事从未停止在科幻小说般的情节里，而是一步步踏实在现实的土壤上。脑机接口技术从设想到落地，从怀疑到认可，从小范围应用到大面积推广，每一步都写满了努力与坚持。正是这些不懈的努力，让更多被判定为不可能的康复成了可能，让一顶顶神奇的帽子和钢铁侠手套成为传递希望的工具。未来，我们或许会看到更多类似的小节，在这项技术的帮助下，重新站起来，重新拥抱生活。欢迎大家进入6度探索的辩论环节。我们从正反2个角度对本节目进行辩论，请出我们的辩论高手楚天舒、谢琪琪。
我是楚天舒。
我是谢琪琪。
脑机接口技术简直是医学界的超级英雄。你看看这位码农的故事，他不但从瘫痪中恢复过来，还能回到工作岗位继续撸代码，这可是医学奇迹。这技术不仅仅是在修复大脑，它是在给人们第2次生命。
超级英雄？你确定不是钢铁侠和黑镜的合体？戴个帽子就能恢复神经功能，听起来像是科幻小说中的情节。别忘了，脑机接口技术还处于发展阶段，成功案例固然鼓舞人心，但我们不能忽视失败的可能性和长远的伦理问题呀。
谢琪琪，你这么说就有点乌鸦嘴了吧？你看数据说话，数理创新的脑机接口平台已经帮助了1000多名患者，效果显著。你要知道，医学进步总是从点点滴滴积累起来的。拿诺贝尔奖的心脏移植手术，一开始也有人质疑，但如今呢？拯救了多少生命？
楚天舒，我知道你是技术派的死忠粉，但别忘了，历史上有多少神奇疗法最终被证明是昙花一现。脑机接口还需要大量的临床验证，而且你真的确定每个病人都能负担得起这顶高科技帽子？别到时候变成了医疗资源的马太效应，有钱人能恢复，穷人却只能望而兴叹。
你的担心我理解，但大多数新技术刚开始都是昂贵的。记得当年第一台电脑有多贵吗？如今连小朋友都有平板电脑。市场逐渐成熟后，成本自然会降低。再说了，国家已经在政策上给予了支持，这就是信号。脑机接口技术未来的普及只是时间问题。
是啊，时间问题。可你说的时间有多长？ 5年还是50年？而且你的乐观忽视了伦理和隐私问题。大脑活动被监测和操控，这可是人类最隐私的领域。就像乔治·奥威尔的1984，你不担心有一天这东西被滥用吗？控制大脑的未来听起来不那么美好吧？
谢谢大家收看六度探索。这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与六度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的六博士提出你能想出的任何问题。六度世界网址是6do world， 请介绍给你的亲朋好友。大家好，欢迎来到我们的六度解析节目。今天我们要挑战的是中国经济所面临的严峻形势，特别是在习近平的领导下，他的重点似乎仍然是经济安全，而不是解决长期存在的问题。中国的房地产危机已经进入第3年，成为经济的重大拖累。尽管一些经济学家呼吁政府推出刺激措施来提振消费，但习近平似乎更专注于让中国在科技创新领域成为全球领导者。然而，这些举措是否能真正解决中国经济的根本问题，仍然是一个巨大的问号。中国的增长正在放缓，并且变得越来越不平衡，主要依靠出口和工厂投资，而消费者削减支出，房地产市场低迷，地方政府负债累累，外国投资者撤资。习近平在即将举行的党会议上会做出重大政策调整吗？这似乎不太可能，他仍然更关注于减少对西方技术的依赖，并在关键行业中占据主导地位。这样的策略能否真正解决中国经济的深层次问题？我们将在节目中进一步探讨，请大家继续收看详细内容。欢迎收看本期特别节目，我是您的主持人。在今天的节目中，我们将深入探讨中国经济面临的挑战，以及习近平主席在这一关键时刻所采取的优先措施。文章的来源是《华尔街日报》，由 Jason Douglas 和 Rebecca Fong 撰写，最新更新于2024年7月15日。这篇文章详细分析了中国目前经济遇到的困境，以及习近平在政策会议上所优先考虑的方向。习近平主席的愿景是将中国打造成制造业巨头，引领全球技术创新。然而，这一战略目标正给中国经济带来越来越大的压力。经济增长正在减速，并且变得更加不平衡，主要靠出口和大量的工厂投资来支撑，而其他经济领域则显得萧条。消费者缩减开支，房地产市场低迷，地方政府债台高筑，外国投资者纷纷撤资，而此时中国人口也在迅速老龄化。本周的中共全会通常被称为第3次全会，每5年举行一次。以往的全会曾带来重大的经济改革，比如1978年邓小平将中国引向经济自由化的道路。然而，今年习近平似乎更加专注于减少中国对西方技术的依赖，降低对其他国家在半导体和其他必需品上的依赖，并在他说未来关键的领域如清洁能源、电动汽车和先进计算机技术中占据主导地位。为此，习近平向中国的工厂投入了大量资金，但到目前为止，效果喜忧参半。国内增长在减弱，今年第2季度经济同比增长 4.7%， 低于第1季度的 5.3%。与此同时，海外贸易紧张局势不断加剧，廉价的中国商品引发了新一轮中国产品冲击的担忧，类似于2000年代初期廉价中国商品影响美国和其他国家产业和就业的情况。经济学家认为，过于依赖制造业并不能解决中国的问题，甚至可能加剧与美国和其他国家的关系恶化。尽管如此，全会预计会政治上支持习近平的愿景，而忽视西方国家呼吁通过更多中国消费来实现更平衡的增长。未能鼓励更多中国消费，将导致更多贸易争端，尤其是在中国出口的电动汽车、钢铁等产品激增的背景下。康奈尔大学贸易政策教授、前国际货币基金组织中国部门负责人 Ishwar Prasad 表示， 中国经济陷入困境，急需刺激消费和经济改革，以恢复私营部门的信心。一些经济学家建议中国政府推出刺激措施以促进消费，类似于过去几次全会所带来的市场友好型改革。1993年和2003年的全会以及1978年的开放，往往被认为是推动中国经济腾飞的关键。而2013年的全会则提出市场力量应在经济中起决定性作用，并放宽了实行多年的独生子女政策。经济学家预计，今年可能会有一些措施来应对中国的问题，可能包括对税收制度的调整，以帮助负债累累的地方政府稳定财政，或者一些努力以恢复外国投资者的吸引力。一些人希望政府进一步改革，修改消费税，以为地方政府创造新的收入来源，从而激发地方消费。另一些人则认为，中国的户籍制度需要改革，以确保工人可以无忧无虑地搬到有工作机会的地方。然而，这些措施可能不足以在当前中国面临两大严重危机的情况下，将经济拉回正轨。这两大危机分别是房地产市场的下滑和地方政府隐藏债务带来的风险。中国的房地产危机已经持续了3年，北京收紧对开发商的限制，以控制过度借贷，使房地产业及相关行业从前占年度国内生产总值的1/4，现在却成为主要拖累。2024年前6个月的房地产投资同比缩减了 10.1%。尽管自2022年底以来，中国政策制定者推出了一系列措施，试图振兴市场，包括降低抵押贷款利率和取消许多购房限制，但效果不佳。2024年前6个月的新房销售同比下降了 26.9%， 中国70个主要城市的新房均价在2024年6月同比下降了 4.9%。与此同时，尽管政府努力解决问题，数百万套预售房仍未完工。中国央行提供了270亿美元的无息资金，供商业银行贷给开发商以重启建设项目，但银行由于担心风险过大，不愿意放贷，导致资金大部分未被利用。开发商已停止从地方政府购买土地，削减了城市的重要资金来源。2021年至2023年间，地方政府的土地销售收入骤降 33%， 2024年前5个月又同比下降了 14%。许多省市现在处于严重的财政困境，无力偿还他们近年来积累的估计7万亿到11万亿美元的隐藏债务。利息支付限制了一些地方政府在基本服务和其他优先事项上的支出能力。习近平希望通过提升制造业来创造一个更强大的经济，以应对这些和其他挑战。他的目标体现在一些共产党口号中，如新生产力和高质量增长，指的是他认为可以推动中国下一代增长的技术驱动行业。然而，他的计划的负面影响也逐渐显现。提升工厂产出而不提升需求，导致了数月的价格下跌和企业利润疲弱。此外，还有国际社会对中国出口激增的不安情绪。在中国，服务业就业人数多于制造业，但习近平的愿景对提升他们的收入和消费几乎没有提及。周一的数据凸显了中国当前增长模式的不均衡。6月中国贸易顺差创单月纪录，而今年前6个月工业生产同比增长了 6%， 同期零售销售仅增长了 3.7%。中国经济显示出严重不平衡。法国兴业银行首席中国经济学家魏尧在周一的研究报告中表示，经济在外部需求和供给侧推动下蹒跚前行，而国内需求仍然非常低迷。以上是我们对中国当前经济形势的详细分析和探讨。感谢您的收看，请大家继续关注本节目的深入探索。谢谢大家收看6度探索，这是一个由科学家、经济学家、媒体人、工程技术人员合作建立的新型媒体，网友与6度 AI 参与合作完成各种内容，这些内容不能作为任何决策或法律的意见。这是一个新型的试验性媒体方式，我们希望得到大家的支持，修正错误。网友可以参与讨论，也可以向万能的6博士提出你能想出的任何问题。6度世界网址是6do world。请介绍给你的亲朋好友。
I mean, it is quite an occasion to mark 75 years, first of all, because In 1949, when NATO was founded, this was certainly unprecedented for the United States to form this peacetime alliance, given the history of the United States and the admonition by George Washington in his farewell address not to join permanent alliances. And I don't think the founders would have really expected this alliance would still be needed 75 years later, or that it would have grown so much. And I think that's the first thing to note for this summit, as you mentioned, Asla. I mean, this was 12 countries, the US, Canada, and 10 European countries in 1949. And we are at 32 now with the addition of Sweden and Finland, also something that would have been hard to expect given the history of those countries. So certainly, we come into this summit with a lot of things that NATO has reason to be proud of, the importance of the institution for the security of its members. And as you said, it is overshadowed by this horrific war by Russia against Ukraine and the need to support Ukraine. And I think first and foremost, I'll be looking for what is being said about Ukraine and the continued support for the country and the question of how the NATO members move beyond what they said last year regarding future Ukrainian membership to try to say something a little stronger about Ukraine's future in NATO and more broadly in the Euro-Atlantic community. Second thing, of course, is this question of how the NATO leaders look given the political crosswinds. President Biden is the host. Lots of questions raised at the debate last Thursday about him, and I think we will be looking to see how he looks, how he sounds, and I'll leave it to Tara to talk about President Macron, but he certainly comes in much less strong than one might have expected when this summit was first announced. And I think that the standing of the leaders, the elections now between now and next week in the UK and a change in government there is certainly plenty to look for as we go into this summit.
Constanza, let me turn to you. When we were debating what title to have, you were the one that came up with Old and Bold. So it's only appropriate that I tap into you to explain. And also, again, what will you be watching?
Well, like Jim, I've been around long enough to remember several iterations of the theory that NATO is obsolete. When I started off my career as a young journalist 30 years ago, my section head in the political section would send me to Social Democratic Party conferences where the participants would demand that NATO be abolished and superseded, as I said, by the OSCE, which would be in future the guardian of European security. Those were the days. It was unimaginable then, right? Because we all thought that we were heading for political entropy and everybody wanted to be like us, and that Russia would want to be like us and the rest of the world would want to be like us, and all of us would become liberal market democracies.
End of history.
End of history, exactly. Francis Fukuyama. So I also, remember going a little further back, even going to law school in what was then the capital of West Germany, in Bonn, in the midst of the massive anti-Pershing demonstrations, when NATO was very much still in the Cold War, and it was a deterrence and defense alliance. And the reason I mention all this is that we have come full circle. I covered as a journalist NATO becoming an expeditionary alliance, going first to the Balkans and then to Afghanistan, sending missions to the maritime missions to the Horn of Africa. And now we are looking at an adversary who is attacking a large democratic country on the borders of Europe, Ukraine, and is interfering on a daily basis with cyber attacks, sabotage, espionage, and disinformation in the European political space, right? Most people will have heard by now of the the arson attack on a German armaments firm deal on the outskirts of Berlin a few weeks ago. So, which is, interestingly, was attributed very, very quickly to the Russians by the German security services. So NATO and NATO's original defense and deterrence mission has taken on a wholly new urgency, not just because of Ukraine, not just because of the threats on Europe's periphery, but also because of what Russians and others are doing in terms of hybrid warfare within Europe. And so there is going to be a very, very real sense of urgency, and at the same time, as Jim said, a sense of self-questioning. And that's, I think, the old part. The old part is not NATO at this point. It's that some of our leaders are looking pretty old. And old either in the physical sense or in the sense that they have outstayed their political welcome, like the Tory leader Rishi Sunak in London. And I expect that we will have a new prime minister in the UK joining us next week for the NATO summit.
Yes, UK elections taking place shortly and expected to lead in a late victory. Exactly. So, Tara, let me turn to you. Bring a European perspective into this. How are Europeans approaching next week's summit? Both Jim and Constanza have mentioned that people will be focusing on President Joe Biden as well. Is he looking focused? Is he energetic? How are other world leaders approaching him? But there are also other leaders who are having political difficulties in their homeland. So on to you.
Thanks a lot. Very glad to be here. I have to say, being a French person living in DC and following both French and US politics right now is quite an experience. I don't know if I can recommend it to many people. It's a lot. It's a bit overwhelming. And you're right. I think leaders will be scrutinized, and I'll get to how Emmanuel Macron will feature in this discussion in a minute. But I just want to say, in terms of a larger European perspective, what we've seen is 2 additional European member states, EU member states who've joined NATO, who've actually reinforced the alliance, strengthened the alliance. So we've seen actual NATO enlargement happening, mostly because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And so there has been a form of dynamism in the alliance that we hadn't seen in a while. Macron was known also for having said that he thought NATO was brain dead. That was in 2019. I think we've seen wholly different alliances then, with a lot of political purpose. And there are many questions around the political cohesion of the alliance, the role that Hungary will play. In particular, Hungary has just taken over the presidency of the European Union Council with this motto, "Make Europe Great Again," which is a paraphrase of Donald Trump's motto for America, "Make America Great Again." So we need to see how Europeans will come in. Will there be unity or fragmentation or diversity of views? I'm guessing it's going to be a bit of all that. Many questions, of course, around US leadership and how US leadership will feature in support for Ukraine in the coming months, because that question is really key. I think one of the main issues that will have to be settled at this summit is the future relationship of Ukraine with NATO. And we'll discuss this further on. Is it full membership, not membership, an invitation? This expression of the bridge, we've heard it quite a lot. What does the bridge mean? Is it a bridge to NATO? Is it a bridge to a consolidation of Ukraine as a democracy? Secretary Blinken was at Brookings 2 days ago, and he discussed this publicly. The recording of his intervention is available online on our website. And what he referred to additional air defense support. But I thought it was interesting that he was explaining it as a way of consolidating Ukrainian democracy, reconstructing Ukraine's economy. And so this was military support, but for a political and economic purpose. So I'm guessing we'll hear more of that next week. Let me just do 1 minute on Macron. I was not going to avoid it, don't worry. I have been trying to avoid it these past days because it's a bit overwhelming. I think, as most of our viewers know, we are in the middle of 2 rounds of snap parliamentary elections that were called because Emmanuel Macron dissolved the National Assembly on the evening of the results of the European elections, which were not favorable to his party. And so The first round,
his party did rather poorly.
His party did really bad in the European elections. So the Rassemblement National, the far right, got 32% of the vote share, and Emmanuel Macron's party came in second with 14.7% of the vote share. So, not even half of what Rassemblement National got. And so he decided to dissolve the National Assembly, leading to snap elections. His party did really badly in these snap elections, the first round of which were held last Sunday. So now what we're seeing are basically three blocks in the French political landscape: a far-right, right-wing bloc, a center bloc, basically led by Emmanuel Macron's party, and the left and the far left together in a coalition. And Macron's party is the third bloc in this. The second round of the elections are happening this Sunday, and it seems likely that his party will lose and the far right is going to come in first. And so the question is, will they be in capacity to form a government with an absolute majority at the National Assembly or not? There are many questions around this. I won't get into it right now, but that's the main issue. If they do, they might be in capacity to form a government. I think that's highly unlikely, considering the elections. We'll get the results of the elections on Sunday evening, and the NATO summit starts next Tuesday. But if they do get an absolute majority, Emmanuel Macron could actually find himself coming in with a far-right foreign minister and defense minister who have totally antagonistic views to his in terms of support to Ukraine, European support to Ukraine, NATO support to Ukraine. So we would see a totally bicephalic French perspective, totally contradictory, with no stability, little visibility in terms of who represents France and what France is going to do, which I think will be quite scary, both for European and American allies. But the other option is that, and I think the most likely, is that he will show up on his own with no foreign or defense minister, because a government will not have had time to be formed, and then he'll actually also seem isolated. And a lot of the work and ideas that he's been putting forward for a stronger Europe he won't be able to be the person embodying these ideas and fighting for them because of this isolation.
Macron, of course, one of the European leaders pushing for membership, NATO membership for Ukraine. So, Michael, I want to turn to you and pivot back to Ukraine and NATO. Last year at the Vilnius summit, NATO summit in Vilnius, the big debate was, will Ukraine be a member of NATO? Will it be given a membership perspective, membership action plan or not? And that's what media largely focused on. This year, we pretty much know that it will not have an official membership course. It is what Tara and Jim and Constanza talked about, a bridge being a concept, a bridge to membership. So I want to turn to you. It's not all doom and gloom. There is also commitment for security agreements with Ukraine and allocation of more funds from the Russian assets, 50 billion and so on. What will you be watching in next week's summit? And how does NATO fit into the whole equation when it comes to Ukraine in your understanding of the end game?
Thanks, Asla. It's great to be with everybody. Well, let me say a couple of critical things about the summit, but then also some positive things I see happening, and try to present a little bit of a balanced perspective as I see things. First of all, I would counsel our friends in government not to use the word celebration any more than they have to talk about this gathering. It doesn't feel like a moment for celebration when a war is ongoing in Europe, not to mention Gaza, not to mention a huge tragedy in Sudan, which is pretty close to NATO as well. And I don't like the term. I know what people mean by it, in the sense that, of course, NATO is an amazing alliance, and it's been very important for our security, and it still is relevant, and still is, as Constanza was saying, reinvented in ways that are important and contribute substantially to our security. But I just don't like the term celebration when the world is facing what it's facing today. Second, I was at one of NATO's main organizational hubs 2 weeks ago in Rome, Italy, at the NATO Defense College. And it was a good conversation, a good discussion, but some of the mood was, why do we keep having these summits? NATO doesn't have a charter that requires an annual summit. Last year's, as you say, wound up being a fiasco in many ways. Luckily, most of the world doesn't pay that much attention to NATO summits, or at least most publics don't. And so the whole brouhaha over President Zelensky being upset that he wasn't getting a clear path to membership was fairly quickly forgotten, I would hazard to guess, by most people except people like us. And so in one sense, there's no great harm done. But I don't see quite why we're forcing ourselves to come up with big new initiatives. You mentioned a bridge to membership. I mean, how many more metaphors are we going to use to talk about the fundamental reality, which is that we're not willing to commit? And so I find that conversation borderline useless, maybe even counterproductive. But let me now say a couple more positive things. We had General Eric Smith yesterday at Brookings, the Commandant of the Marine Corps. And even though his main focus, like many in the US military, is on China, at least in terms of longer term preparations, he was quick to say that a lot of NATO allies are very interested in working with the Marines. You know, we're all trying to learn the lessons of the Ukraine war, but also benefit from this new energy in the alliance to strengthen the 32, make sure we can defend our own territory, absorb now a stronger Nordic contingent, and also just make sure that that eastern flank is prepared against any kind of probing or other mischievous behavior that Putin may contemplate in the future. And there is some positive energy in the alliance at a military planning level and a political level in that regard. Another point that I'm encouraged by is that I heard this at the NATO Defense College in conversation. I've heard it elsewhere at the Pentagon and other places recently. It does appear that the ground that Ukraine was losing through the spring, that dynamic has been largely stanched, largely stymied. And I think the $61 billion aid package from the Congress, overdue as it was, is beginning to help. Let me also give a big shout out to European allies in Canada, because as we've shown in our Ukraine index, they're actually doing more for Ukraine than the United States, even counting the $61 billion. Donald Trump was wrong about that in the debate. Europe is really coming through in a burden-sharing way. And the combined effort of all of us is now again helping Ukraine stay on its feet. And the last point I'll make in that same regard, and this is related to an idea that Professor Lise Howard at Georgetown and I have been trying to develop over the last year and a half, thinking about alternative security architectures for Europe. And it also builds, in some ways, it relates to what President Macron has talked about with putting perhaps some NATO troops on Ukrainian territory in a defensive mode. Lise and I aren't necessarily advocating that, but we are thinking about having more Western forces, or at least Western military personnel in uniform someday on Ukrainian soil as a potential alternative to, or maybe even a complement to, but we see it first and foremost as a potential alternative to NATO membership in a way that may make a longer term arrangement with Russia more negotiable. I don't know. I'm not making that claim. Lise and I are trying to develop an alternative concept that may or may not prove useful. But what I like about what I've seen in the news the last 3 days, and I'll finish on this point, is that NATO now wants to have more presence in Ukraine, it appears, with the idea of having not NATO combat forces, but a NATO political mission and a military liaison mission in Kyiv. And that's the kind of dynamic that I think may provide us an alternative way to ensure that Ukraine is never conquered by Russia in the future, getting the Western presence inside of Ukraine much denser, and partly reflected and manifested in military terms. Again, my preference would not necessarily be through a NATO membership, which is not going to happen soon anyway, but there may be other mechanisms by which we can essentially build a dense presence that serves as a tripwire against Russian attack on the center parts of Ukraine, and that just strengthens our long-term relationship. So I see that as potentially interesting, not a huge development on a par with NATO membership, but still potentially a useful way of ensuring that Ukraine will remain sovereign and independent long-term.
Thank you, Mike, for these interesting ideas. I want to stay with you and go backwards because while, as you mentioned, there is all these important developments also in support of Ukraine that NATO is being engaged with, liaison, and obviously, you know, G7 funds and security guarantees. And it is the case that the front lines have stabilized, particularly around Kharkiv. The Russian assault seems to have been stopped for now. But it is also the case that Vladimir Putin seems to have the upper hand psychologically. He looks comfortable, he looks confident, and the global South, outside of Europe and North America, there is this idea that Russia is not losing. Now, you and I were present when we last week when we had a chance to speak to a former official, senior official, who described the need to have some sort of a shock effect on the situation, coming up with a policy that would create some sort of a shock in the system so that Putin might be more amenable to, at some future point, to negotiations and ceasefires and so on and so forth. Are you thinking of this new idea in that sense, in that framework?
That was an interesting comment. And that is perhaps the kind of dynamic that needs to be established to put Putin back on his heels a little bit. I don't know that that is quite as big of a question, however, whether or not such a shock could occur, as what happens with European and American politics over the next 6 months and where we are collectively as an alliance and our willingness to support Ukraine in 2025. My best guess is that I don't claim to make a guess about what Donald Trump would do as president, but if we get into 2025 and support continues, I think we sort of owe it to Ukraine to take one last serious crack at trying to regain as much of its territory as it can. I don't expect that there will be that much success, but I've been wrong about many things in military analysis in my career, and I know it's an inexact science at best, so I could be wrong again. And I think, therefore, we do owe Ukraine this chance. But then if that doesn't play out very successfully over the spring, summer of 2025, then we're at a crossroads. And as you say, Putin may still be willing to fight for multiple years on end, assuming at that point he can outlast us with or without Trump in the White House. But he may also decide that holding on to whatever fraction of Ukraine he's got at that point, and right now it's about 18% of pre-2014 Ukraine, that's enough, especially if you can keep Ukraine out of NATO long term, and maybe you can have a negotiation. I don't know. But I think that's how I expect the next 12 months to play out. And then we'll be at a crossroads where I can better answer your question about the long term. I agree that Putin right now seems to have the upper hand, seems to think he has the upper hand at least. And it would be nice if we could somehow change that psychology, but I'm not sure any one act on the battlefield is going to do it so much as seeing how politics evolve over the next 12 months, and then if and when a Ukrainian counteroffensive is attempted, whether it can really show any success.
Tara, I want to ask you about European contributions to defense spending. That's been an evergreen topic at NATO summits, but now we have 23 allies, 23 NATO members meeting the 2% target. They're not delinquent, in the words of Donald Trump. They have a big stake in Europe's defense, but how is it going? Are Europeans able to ramp up defense production? Are they able to transition to a greater sort of war economy, for lack of a better word?
So you're right, they're doing a lot more, even though what's clear now is that the 2% goal of spending in defense, 2% of GDP, in defense spending is not just a threshold, but it's only a ceiling now. Actually, a lot of experts are calling for 3 or 4%, and we're seeing countries in Eastern Europe in particular who are spending actually closer to 3 or 4%.
Including Poland.
Including Poland, absolutely. And so we're seeing, I think, a dynamic towards actually more than 2% because there's a necessity for it now. I think the term war economy is still very much taboo in many places in Europe, because even though there is war in Europe, the European Union, for instance, is not at war with Russia. And so the French president has used it a few times, but a lot of people are, I think, a bit wary of using that term, even though it is quite clear that Vladimir Putin has put his own country in war economy. He's spending almost 8% of GDP in defense, has totally transformed his industrial base. So he could, Mike, and you are absolutely right, he could spend a lot more time at war with Ukraine until he finally gets what he wants. He has decided to put his country in that situation. We can't, I don't think as Europeans, we can decide that we need to be in a war economy, but we can decide to do a lot more. And I think we've done that already. One issue that I hope is a pretty nerdy issue, but I hope can bring a bit of a glimmer of hope is reinforced EU-NATO cooperation. I think there are two indications that this might go in a much more positive direction right now. First of all, there's an institutional dimension with the change at the Commission and in terms of institutional leadership inside the European Union. We're seeing Kaja Kallas, right now the head of Estonia, who's going to become the High Representative for Foreign Policy at the European Union, very much a NATO girl. She knows NATO very well, but she knows the EU very well too. And the new NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, formerly Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who also knows the two institutions very well. And what we've seen is a lot of defiance coming from both institutions for the past 3 decades, with a lot of reluctance to work together. I'm hoping that with these two new people at the head both of EU diplomacy and NATO, we might see a lot more EU-NATO cooperation, and I think that's quite key. Again, with Sweden and Finland, 2 EU member states having joined NATO now, we really need it. And the second positive aspect that I see is more concrete in a way than the institutional, though leadership and personal relationship, of course, matter in foreign policy. There's actually willingness from the private sector. So 2 days ago, the European Investment Fund and NATO Venture Capital Fund have announced that they would co-sponsor programs together to ramp up the defense industrial bases in Europe. This is another, again, pretty nerdy, but huge taboo that has been broken. The European Investment Bank didn't want to fund projects linked to defense and security for the past 50 years. It decided to change that and to overthrow that decision in January this year. So we're seeing actually European Union institutions and funds willing to fund defense industrial ramp up. This is something that is, of course, due to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And so we're seeing, I'm hopeful, between the funding issue that is not totally resolved, but at least a lot more open now, and the institutional dimension, I think an opportunity for a lot more cooperation between the two institutions. But, you know, there are also, politics is also happening everywhere in Europe. And so we were warned that there would be war fatigue coming from European populations in terms of support to Ukraine. We haven't seen that in the past 2.5 years, but we're seeing governments who are claiming war fatigue. And I'm actually more scared of certain governments in Europe right now who are going to look at doing everything they can to undermine support to Ukraine. European populations are quite clear in polls that they still support it very much. But I'm more fearful of a number of governments who would feel emboldened by what's happening in France, clearly what's happening in Italy, little visibility coming from Germany as well. So I think we're at a moment right now where there's a lot of expectations from the UK. I think if the UK can show direction in terms of leadership, but the UK has also a huge defense industrial base, there's a lot that they could do with the continent. I think we need not just one country, but several European countries coming together and leading that. I think the UK would be key, but of course, the eastern flank is absolutely key there too. Poland has a huge defense industrial base. So I think we're going to look at a reconfiguration also of where leadership comes in when it comes to European security and defense.
Constanza, can I ask you to weigh in on the European side of this equation, particularly on the debate on Trump-proofing NATO? Now, of course, Brookings is an independent, nonpartisan organization, and we are not taking part in endorsing a candidate in the elections. But Donald Trump, his name, the possibility of a second Trump administration looms large in any debate on defense and security policy. There's been this idea of Trump-proofing NATO. Share us your perspective on what's going on in Europe, whether this is possible, and add to it, please, your impressions from Germany, because you also had a chance to spend some time there.
Sure. Well, if I may, I'd like to pick up a couple of strands. I'm right now, and frankly, a little bit of a pessimistic mood, although I agree very much with Tara that I think European politicians generally underrate the willingness of European publics, from my experience, to make sacrifices in this particular situation. I think people understand just how serious this is. And I think they understand because it is so clear that Putin is locked in a logic of war, of truly brutal and sadistic war, right? Is engaged in lying all the time, right? His troops are committing horrific crimes in the areas of Ukraine that they have occupied. And this is a movie we've seen before, right? We saw it especially in the breakup of Yugoslavia, the war, the genocidal wars that came out of that. And to anybody who's been around a little longer, and that includes me, Putin at this point is very reminiscent of Milosevic or Saddam Hussein in his late years, right? There is very little realistic hope, right, that any sort of stable equilibrium of armistice or peace is possible with a man who is so obsessed, right, not just with eviscerating Ukraine, right, with destroying Ukrainian sovereignty, but also with undermining liberal modernity in Europe, right? I think that is a realization that has really hit home in Europe. What I'm slightly more concerned about is the ability of European governments and institutions to rise to the occasion. And I think I'm, for the following reasons. Then it starts with Germany. I think the only reason we're not seeing German early elections right now, because the coalition are the three members of the German coalition are very unhappy with each other. They have been struggling to get their annual budget signed off at the cabinet table. They've had to defer it from last week, from today in 2 weeks. And the only reason why they're not falling apart at this point is that there is no constitutional, legal, or political path to early elections. Unlike in France or Britain, where calling snap elections is much easier and constitutionally permissible. It's not in Germany. And the other thing that the coalition, but also the opposition, are deathly afraid of is 3 state elections in the fall, where the hard right and the hard left are trending very, very high, between 38% and 49% in the polls right now. And of course, they were the winners of the German part of the European Parliament elections a couple of weeks ago. So what that means, the reason I'm saying all this is that it means that the German leadership also is fragile and undermined. And in a situation where you have the possibility, as Tara just explained, of a very inward-looking France, a new UK Prime Minister just come on the scene, a very experienced Danish Prime Minister who's left and being, a Dutch Prime Minister, and who has been replaced by a new hard-right coalition, an Italian Prime Minister, Meloni, who is very angry at having been excluded in the negotiations about filling the top positions in the European Commission. There is a lot of political ferment going on in Europe right now. And one last point that I want to make there, and then I'll come to the Trump-proofing point, but it's important to understand the landscape here. After the European Parliament elections, there were about 103 seats of the 702 in the Parliament that were not assigned to to a parliamentary group. And right now it looks as though the hard right is reforming itself on the hard right margins under the leadership of Viktor Orban. And Marine Le Pen might be joining that group. It's not clear whether the AfD will, but depending on where that moves, there could be, if worst comes to worst, an angry, resentful, and much stronger than before hard-right group in the European Parliament, which has co-decision-making powers with the executive, and would I think be quite willing to throw spanners in the works. And this brings me to NATO. These European politics don't stop at NATO's door. They do not stop at the door of the North Atlantic Council. It would be naive to expect that this doesn't translate into discussions at the NAC table, especially in case of a Trumpian win in the US elections in November, right? NATO politics aren't Trump-proof, and before that panorama, the question of whether we can organize our defense and deterrence plans, right, and our support for Ukraine in a way that is effective, right, against a Russian aggressor is a very big question mark. And I am I'm on the other side of Mike in the question of Ukrainian membership. I'm not a membership ultra. I'm a pragmatist. But I do think that what I would not like to see is a false promise of membership, or a false membership bridge that ends up like the promise of bringing Turkey into the European Union, Asli. I'm sure you will remember that, right? And I think that would undermine the credibility of NATO, and it would undermine the security not just of Ukraine, but also of Europe. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it was a great answer, and you actually took the conversation to where I want to go. First, I will say that we had a number of questions from the audience, and you'll be interested to know that there's been a lot of questions about the meaning of NATO, its vision. What is it good for at this point? These are not anti-NATO questions. They're not coming from sort of a pro-Russian perspective, but what does it stand for in today's world? Or, should we get rid of it once the war Ukraine is won in favor of Ukraine, and replace it with a pan-European security structure? Or should it expand to be a security style institution for Northeast Asia? Should we include the Middle East in NATO, and so on? So I realize that there is a good deal of question that people have in their minds about NATO's purpose. And I will also flag that Jim Goldgeier has an explainer.
Yes.
What is NATO, which is up on our website as part of our explainer series. But Jim, I know you, like Constanza, believe that membership for Ukraine would have been a good idea and to deter also Russia. But I want you to respond to something else. Robert O'Brien, one of the national security advisor for former President Donald Trump, has written a piece for Foreign Affairs. And what he says is that Trump, for his part, has made clear that he would like to see a negotiated settlement to the war that ends in Ukraine, that ends the killing and preserves the security of Ukraine. His approach would be to continue to provide lethal aid to Ukraine, financed by European countries, he notes, while keeping the door open to diplomacy with Russia. He would also push NATO to rotate ground and air forces to Poland to augment its capacities, he says. But it's more the point about negotiations in Russia and how to deal with Russia. What do you expect would happen if Trump was elected? And if anything you want to add to the whole membership and endgame debate that Mike and Constanza have started?
Sure. Well, also I'd like to you mentioned some of these questions about what NATO's good for, and I think it's all tied together because at least to date, the NATO members see their security as intertwined. They see a value in being part of this larger grouping, a military alliance that's there to look out for the security of all the member states and to do it together. And this is fundamentally a question as to whether Donald Trump believes in that premise. And the Robert O'Brien Foreign Affairs piece seemed to be an attempt to put a coherence on a Trump worldview, but I don't think anybody else speaks for Donald Trump. And I think we don't know whether he will, in fact, remain committed to the alliance. Worth noting that the U.S. Congress in last December, in the passage of the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, included a provision that a U.S. president can't withdraw from NATO without a 2/3 vote of the U.S. Senate or an act of Congress. This was a bipartisan effort to try to ensure that the United States would remain in NATO. But the U.S. president is pretty unconstrained in foreign policy. And even without a formal withdrawal, there are lots of things the U.S. can do to weaken the alliance. We have seen how important U.S. leadership is. Mike mentioned how much the Europeans are doing, which is true. But Ukraine was also really dependent on getting that aid package through the Congress, on the U.S. getting that aid package through the Congress in March. Because the U.S. has capabilities that the other countries in Europe do not. The United States has played this important leadership role. I think this war has shown how dependent Europe remains on the United States for security against external aggression. And so U.S. leadership remains important, but again, so does this idea that our security is intertwined. You mentioned countries in the Indo-Pacific. The last several years have seen the heads of state of the so-called IP4, Indo-Pacific 4, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, participating in the NATO summit because there is increasing recognition that there are connections across these theaters. It's not that these countries in the Indo-Pacific are going to come to the defense of NATO countries in Europe, or that there's an expectation that Europe would come to their defense if needed in the Indo-Pacific, but that these theaters are connected, and that these alliances of these democracies is important for continued security, especially at a time when Iran and North Korea and China and Russia are increasing their cooperation. Russia couldn't prosecute this war without Chinese support. The Chinese are enabling the Russian economy to survive these sanctions. We saw President Putin go to North Korea, a place he hadn't visited in 24 years, and at 24 years ago it was a stopover. This was I need your support, ammunition for this war, and offered cooperation, technical cooperation in return, and the Iranian support for the war as well. So we are in this situation where I think we do need to recognize how intertwined our security is with our allies, from a U.S. perspective, with our allies in both the Asia and Indo-Pacific and European theaters. It would be great to have a negotiated solution to this war and for the killing to stop. But what kind of negotiated solution, and is Vladimir Putin even interested in a serious negotiation? He has given no indication that he is interested in a serious negotiation. And a negotiated outcome where Ukraine is being asked to cede the territory that Russia occupies to Russia is politically very difficult, and would require that Ukraine have a guarantee that what remains of Ukraine is secure from future Russian aggression. And that's why I support the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, particularly as part of a negotiated solution to this war, so that at least what the sovereign Ukraine that remains would be able to have would be confident that that Russia would not simply resume its aggression down the road. And I think what we've seen from the United States and Canada and Europe to date is a recognition that a secure Ukraine is fundamental to the security of Europe. That a Vladimir Putin who just can continue on in the way that he has in seeking to conquer Ukraine is then truly a threat to the rest of Europe as well.
Thank you. Mike, I want to stay on China because, well, Indo-Pacific, because we also have a number of questions about that. The Biden administration has obviously described China as the pacing challenge. the country with the intent and ability to challenge a rules-based order, and has very much been the focus of administration's efforts on the security domain. How do we think of China in the context of NATO, Indo-Pacific in the context of NATO? And where do you see the issues and dilemmas in this framing?
Thanks, Ursula. And let me say, Jim's answer was excellent, and I agree with 100% of it, with one asterisk about the NATO question. I'm not principally opposed at this point to Ukraine being in NATO. I just don't know what's going to be pragmatic in negotiations. And if an alternative architecture that looks comparably robust can be more negotiable, I just want to preserve that option. That's the way I think about it here in 2024. But on to China. First of all, you mentioned earlier that some people are wondering if NATO should extend its purview to East Asia. My sense is no, that it should not extend Article 5 to allies in Asia. I think NATO has enough to do, and it's a complicated enough organization with enough members. All NATO countries have to think about China, but it doesn't mean the alliance is the right convening location or institution to develop policy, especially military policy. So my instinct is to keep NATO focused on Europe and the near abroad. But again, I'll be curious if others might disagree with that. In terms of how we're thinking about China in the United States, more generally right now, I think that there is, at the Pentagon at least, and I think elsewhere in parts of the government, a sense that we are making progress in improving our deterrent and our focus on the Asia Pacific, even as we cope with tragedy and crisis and conflict in Europe and the Middle East. Some of the defense investments that have been made, as the Marine Corps Commandant discussed yesterday at Brookings, are now panning out. It's not just a Biden administration thing, by the way. It's the Trump and Biden administrations, which ironically on this issue have actually had a great deal of continuity at the Pentagon in particular, but maybe even more broadly than that. And so there is a sense that through military, but also economic instruments, and especially through tightened alliances in the Indo-Pacific region, that we are in fact shoring up our position. But people are still very nervous. They're very nervous about how China is treating the Philippines in the South China Sea, aggressive actions that have included actually violent acts that have seriously injured Filipinos in recent weeks, and that threaten to do so and perhaps even, lead to loss of life in the future. Obviously, the Taiwan issue remains fraught, and China didn't much like the inaugural address by President Lai in Taiwan back in May, although I thought it was pretty reasonable, but China decided to show some objections. So everyone's still nervous and watching very carefully, but feeling like perhaps, at least as a government and even as a bipartisan, initiative across governments and across different administrations, but certainly within the Congress, that we are finding our feet and developing a grand strategy towards China that has some staying power and some prospects for success.
Ms. Tanza and Tara, I want to give you an opportunity to weigh in on the Indo-Pacific debate, since it is pretty much an obsession in Washington. Tara, do you want to go?
Sure. I totally agree with what Mike just said. I think all NATO allies and actually a lot of countries in the world think about China, both as a challenge, as an opportunity. I think in the US, it's mostly as a challenge. And in Europe right now, it's also more and more seen as a challenge. I think China's support to Russia and its war against Ukraine is now leading Europeans to think of China as almost a national or international security issue, which it didn't before. It really thought of it as an economic security issue. But I think we're seeing an evolution from a European perspective still. But Europeans are still very dependent on the Chinese markets, so I think that they're going to try and find a way to remain both close to the US and diversify away from China, all the while not giving up on the Chinese market for a while, as long as they can. Probably, as long as China supports Russia, this very fine balance that the Europeans are working is probably not going to be walkable in the near future. But I think NATO is not the place to discuss this. You can discuss common challenges, a shared assessment of what China's trajectory is right now and what it's doing in the Indo-Pacific, how it's affecting American and European allies in Asia. I think that's absolutely key. That's why it's really interesting that for the past 3 NATO summits, the so-called IP4, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and Japan have been invited to come to the summit, because I think they also need to see what NATO discussions on European security and North Atlantic security are. And I'm really struck that both Japan and South Korea have supported sanctions against Russia. They've been thinking about how to provide weapons to Ukraine. South Korea has a provision in its constitution that it cannot sell or provide weapons to a conflict zone, an active conflict zone. And the South Koreans are thinking about how to move this or how to circumvent it a little bit, because they do see that security in Asia, security in Europe are intertwined, interlinked, and that actually you cannot separate the two theaters right now, especially with a huge China-Russia rapprochement that is not just conjunctural, that is, it's not going to be a short-term, I don't want to call it an alliance because I don't think it is that, but it's a very strong partnership. And so this is a reality that Europeans and Americans will have to face together, I think, with slightly different perspectives, but we'll have to accept, both Europeans and Americans, that even if we have slightly different perspectives, we need to be able to discuss it. So I don't think NATO is meant to deal with the Indo-Pacific, but we need to discuss it. And maybe one word on old and bold, because I think the questions that we got from the audience, really pertain to this debate. And this is the question also that, in a way, this summit and future NATO summits will have to answer regardless of the US presidential election, which is, how does it remain relevant to its core mission, which is the defense of the North Atlantic region? And how does it remain relevant to today's challenges, all the while not superseding or subduing one to the other? How do you do both? How do you think about them? How do you find this common shared assessment of what today's challenges are? I think this is where NATO will manage to remain relevant. And this is why I also agree with what Mike said. I think the idea of a celebration makes me really uneasy. I understand why we need to mention it, but I think with the current context in Europe, what's really important is about acknowledging everything that NATO has done in the past 75 years and looking at how it can prepare itself for the coming decades. And I think if NATO is able to demonstrate that to the American public, to the European publics, then it will have truly won.
Constanza, let me turn to you. Any aspect of this conversation on Indo-Pacific and old and bold that you want to share? Any reflection as final comments?
But I
have a fun question for each panelist to answer. You are invited to the White House gala dinner next week with the NATO heads of state, and you get to sit. You get to pick your own table. You can sit next to whoever you want in terms of world leaders. Who do you want to sit next to, and what do you want to raise?
Is that to me now?
That's to you and to everyone else, but to you now.
Very simple. I would have a lot to say about the other topics, but I won't because of time. I think I'd want to sit next to Giorgia Meloni. For the simple reason that I would like to engage her in conversation, find out what makes her tick. She would be the least predictable, most likely to surprise in conversation. Maybe it would even be fun. What do I know? Certainly not Viktor Orban. Let me just say that.
I think Giorgia Meloni can be a fun dinner partner, it sounds like. But any message you would share with her? Or would it be your old journalist hat and interview?
Look, I think I would be in listening mode. Right. I don't feel like, I mean, who knows? Maybe she would be interested in what I have to say about living in Washington as a German, but I doubt that. And I think I would not want to waste the time in trying to tell her things. I would want to learn how she thinks. That's it.
Jim?
Yeah, well, I would also say Meloni, and the reason is building on what Constanza said. Well, because it's so interesting. I mean, we thought when she came in, we were worried that how pro-Russian she might be, We would never have expected how supportive she would be of Ukraine. She has called out Putin recently on his so-called peace plan. She rightly called it propaganda. I mean, it's nonsense. He's not serious. And she is, relative to other European leaders, she looks pretty strong. So it would be interesting. I would like to talk to her about the need for Ukraine to be able to strike targets in Russia, and would hope that she could come around to support that. It would be an honor to be invited. I would come in from California for the dinner. If I were allowed to pick a table and it wasn't a round table, I would have to take one of the two left-handed seats. For those of you who never think about that, you got to take one of the two corners if you're a lefty, and which means I would only have one person to sit next to in that case. And if Constanza's already sitting next to her, I would probably then want to catch up with. Well, if it's a round table, I'd want to be seated next to another lefty on my left side. But then I'd want to catch up with either Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, or Mr. Rutte, because when I was dean at the School of International Service, I was honored to host both of them at SIS. So it would be nice to catch up.
That's excellent. Mike?
Mike?
Sorry, clicking my audio back on. Well, since Meloni's been spoken for, and since Sanna Marin is no longer Prime Minister of Finland, I would fall back on President Zelensky, and I would just have.
You get to pick the fun guy.
Yeah. And I would just have one question: tell me how this ends, and how we can work together to make it end the best way possible, relatively soon.
I'm surprised nobody wants to sit next to President Erdogan, but he actually doesn't speak English, so that may be.
And is he any fun at all in conversation?
I will not comment on it, Constanza. But Tara, who's your who do you want on your dance card? Who do you want to sit next to?
Well, you won't be surprised if I say Kaja Kallas and Mark Rutte and get them to talk about EU NATO stuff. And Joe Biden, if this is a fantasy dinner, I mean, that doesn't happen many times in your life. If I can sit next to the American president, I wouldn't say no to that. But talk about more, Euro-Atlantic cooperation in the future, and look towards the future would be really my advice. Future for Ukraine, future for Europe, future for the US.
Thank you. Well, I do hope, yes, Constanza?
I just wanted to say I actually was at a summit dinner once in Prague 2002. Because so many delegations had left, they brought in think tankers from a parallel summit. And that was very memorable, not least because of the Czechs have a very, very funky sense of humor. And I saw, and I will never forget this, I saw General Wesley Clark, and Condi Rice, crying with laughter, with tears streaming down their faces after the Czech cultural program. I doubt that we're going to see that here, though.
想成为全球沟通达人吗？六度人工智能语音克隆技术帮你实现梦想。在这个新时代，语言障碍已成过去。我们隆重推出六度人工智能语音克隆系统，这项由欧美亚顶尖专家研发的突破性技术，让你可以克隆自己的声音，并将文字转换成145种语言和方言，提升你的个人和职业生活。想象一下，你可以在日本参加商务会议，在巴西上课，或与意大利的朋友畅聊，而这一切都用你自己的声音、他们的语言进行。 操作简单，只需点击几下，无需复杂的科技知识，就能享受无缝衔接的体验，让世界向你敞开。从商务到教育，从媒体到娱乐，应用场景无处不在。企业可以更好地与全球客户建立联系，教育机构可以提供多语言学习，媒体可以创作更丰富的内容，触达更广泛的受众。今天就来体验这项革命性技术吧。访问